These are Ruminations from Among the Bards. I am Christopher Lewis. And we've been talking about texts on the spiritual life and practice of Hezekiah, stillness in the Orthodox tradition, and how these writings show that the human nature is healed through the indwelling of God. And by healed, we mean restored to its natural state, where it is illumined and made godlike by theosis, which is the experience of God, through the practice and ultimately the miracle of inward prayer. And we mentioned how the rejection of this understanding by Western scholastic theology was a key factor in the great schism between the East and the West. And then we said that in the East, too, this way of life was slowly lost. In Greece and the Balkans, in Serbia and Bulgaria, the Ottoman Turks suppressed and enslaved Christianity, which led to a spiritual and cultural decline. And even in Russia, the great spiritual flowering of remarkable sanctity that was very, very widespread came to an end in the days of St. Demetrius of Rostov, in the court of Peter the Great and the empresses, so that by the 18th century, the practice of hesychasm was largely lost, and the writings of the Desert Fathers on inward prayer were no longer really known. Peter the Great is credited with the modernization of Russia, but this also meant French fashion and the morals of Enlightenment age Europe. It's worth pointing out that Moscow was never a Renaissance city, but it had been very much in touch with the rest of the world. It simply kept its own identity and culture, which was very rich in artistic traditions. Now, there were many reforms needed in Russian government, and there were many good things that Peter the Great did as a ruler. But he also became increasingly suspicious of the old Russian ways. He was entranced with the French court and with the French manners of his young mistresses. And he wanted to divorce his wife. She was too pious, too religious, not according to his taste, and he wanted to marry a young, lively Polish princess named Catherine. After his death, this would be Catherine the First. The bishops would not give their blessing to this divorce. Empress Eudoxia was devoted to St. Dmitri of Rostov, and he was devoted to her. So, Peter the Great proclaimed his wife and her conservative bishops conspirators against his throne. And he had the last Hesychast leaders executed as traitors. St. Dmitri of Rostov was not. He died before this happened. Peter the Great outlawed the kind of monastic life and leadership that gave rise to hesychasm. He was suspicious of it. He did more. He removed the Russian patriarch and the position of the patriarch. He reorganized the church as a secular cabinet under his authority. And this is very much against how the Orthodox Church is supposed to be governed. It's supposed to be independent from the state. Ideally, in Orthodox countries, the church influences the ruler, not the other way around. So he outlawed monastic development, and then he imprisoned his own son, and he killed him in a fit of rage. Now, this reminds us eerily of a previous crisis in Russian history, a crisis of succession known as the Time of Troubles. This is when the succession to the throne broke down, and society suffered greatly in a period of chaos. There was loss of law and order, brigandage, invasions of foreign countries, and this was because Ivan the Terrible killed his own son and successor in a fit of rage. If we go back a generation before him, we find that his father, Vasily III, wanted to divorce his wife and marry someone new, and the bishop said, You're not supposed to do this. We're not supposed to allow this. And bishops even warned him, if you do this, it's going to cause a terrible scourge on the country. Well, Ivan the Terrible, who was the son of this second marriage, was this scourge. He was a very interesting figure. He was the best and the worst of rulers. He was very likely a victim of insanity caused through mercury poisoning from the boyars that's the Russian nobles, that he was always so suspicious of. So he killed his own son, like Peter the Great did, in a fit of rage, and this led to decades of lawless anarchy. That was the time of troubles. Now, the Russians did not want to endure another succession crisis like that, so when Peter the Great died without a male heir, they decided to allow a succession of empresses, and this is the reign of the empresses. And they were careful in their romantic liaisons not to allow any lover to become czar and usurp their power. And they had the church under their thumb because of the arrangements that Peter the Great had made. And the court became heavily influenced by French manners, morals, and philosophy. The empresses decreed actually that it was illegal to become a monk until one had served his military service and was already 50 years of age. Then you could become a monk. As a result, the spiritual life of the Russian church lost its spiritual core, which was the hesychastic life. And after a century, it faded from memory. Now, this is all to lead up to a story that I want to tell. And this is one of the great epic stories in all the history of humanity. And it's no exaggeration. So if you compare Odysseus' search throughout the world for his way home, or Aeneas searching for his new homeland, promised for his people, all the trials and battles he fought, this is like that, except this was the quest to find the greatest truth that had ever been revealed to mankind, the true golden fleece or the golden bough, the true secret of immortality, if you will, to not only find the Holy Grail, but what is contained within the Holy Grail, that is, the life of sanctification. Now, this is not to say that the sacramental life had been lost in Russia, but the goal of the sacramental life had been lost. Because, first of all, there's this truth, that mankind exists for the purpose of becoming like God. And what does this godlikeness in humanity look like? And how can this be obtained? Because it was still remembered by a very few who had the inspiration and imagination to perceive this sacred recollection that it once had been. But these teachings were lost. Now, at this time, the collection of texts that we know as the Philokalia did not exist. It never had. But the writings that make up this collection were well known, and there were teachers who could teach this way of life. But now that's what had been lost. And so this is the tale of Saint Paisius Velichkovsky of Russia, who wanted nothing more but to pursue the life in God, to be a monk, a true monk. He thirsted for the divine. But by his time, all serious monks had left the country. So he found himself in a monastery, and he began his obedience as an engraver in a print shop. But he knew that something was missing, and he wasn't sure what it was, but he knew from what he had read that the only way to find it is through obedience and humility to a wise elder. He needed the guidance of a true master of the spiritual life, and this is what he was looking for. But what he saw was not the fullness of the Christian life. He could not find the ardent interior life of prayer that he had read about in the lives of the saints. But he kept hearing that there had been some of these kinds of elders somewhere in the borders of Russia, in the border of Ukraine, somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains maybe. And so, like many others at his time, he left Russia illegally. This was not something that he was supposed to do. He crossed the border secretly and he made his way to Mount Athos in Greece, which was the remnant of the Byzantine culture where the great monasteries had been built 1,000 years before to be schools of these spiritual masters. But even on Mount Athos, after 500 years of Ottoman domination, it wore down the Greeks to an existence of mere survival, even on Mount Athos. And even there, which had once been the rich prize of all Byzantine lands, richly endowed by emperors and kings, with extensive ancient libraries, beautiful gold and silver vessels, relics, wonderful gospels, every art imaginable, this had for long been the prime place for looters and pirates to go looking for plunder. So even before the fall of Byzantium, this was a problem. And this is why the monasteries on Mount Athos look like medieval fortresses with walls and towers. But after the Turks gained possession of Mount Athos, they actually moved in. They made the monks serve them. They treated them like slaves. And so monastic organization and leadership broke down. And the state of education, which is so important to Orthodox practice, was lost. It broke down, and those monks who survived and stayed were pretty much left to their own devices, and by this time were often unaware of what Athonite monasticism had once been. Well, Paisius knew that Russian monasticism had come from Mount Athos, and he knew he was looking for the writings of its great teachers. And he knew some of the names: Gregory of Palamas, Gregory of Sinai, Simeon the new theologian, St. Hesychus the priest, and others. And so he began to ask, where could he find their books? And the answer of the monks was, not only do we not know where to find them, we have never even heard these names before you mentioned them. Well, he didn't give up. He searched everywhere. He found that some of the Russians had a few Slavonic translations of some of these writers, but they were in poor condition. They were almost unreadable, and it was as though they had been translated from books that no one understood because the translations were very difficult to understand. So this was frustrating, but it was a start. And so he started there, and other monks began to gather around him, and they asked him to be their guide. Well, he was still looking for a teacher himself, but he accepted them out of compassion, knowing that they had to continue their search for better copies of these precious spiritual books. And so he couldn't find them. And then one day he's walking with his companions over the roughest terrain of the Athonite Peninsula. The very end of the Athonite Peninsula, it rises to the peak of Mount Athos. And the peaks there are very rugged. And there's no big monasteries there. There's little tiny cells, and a lot of these were abandoned. And they were walking along a very difficult path here, and they looked down and they saw a little shack perched on a cliffside with a tiny garden and a barrel of rainwater. And so they went there, he and his companions, to ask for some roots to eat. And the host went out to prepare them some food. And as he was waiting, he looked on the rough plank table, and he saw there one of the books he had been looking for by St. Peter of Damascus. And he was amazed. And when the monk came back, he asked him, "Do you have any others of these books?" And they said, "Well, we have a few. We have Anthony the Great, some of Gregory of Sinai, Hesychius," and they named off a few others. And St. Paisius was overjoyed. And he says, "Why does no one know about these? Why does no one even hear about these anymore?" And these monks explained that the reason was that these books had been written in the classical Greek of the Byzantine era. And even in the Byzantine era, this classical Greek of the early fathers was no longer really understood by anyone except for the very well educated. So very few Greeks could read the ancient Greek anymore. And so he began to make some copies, and he begged these brothers to make him more copies, and he began to look for more. And about this time, perhaps a little bit before, he had met an elder, an older monk from the Carpathian Mountains. And he was actually Russian, but he lived in Romania. And this elder had actually tonsured Paisius and gave him the name of Paisius. And this elder seemed to know the interior life. And so he went looking for him, and he found him in Romania. And that is where he found this tradition of Hezekiah. Now, Romania is a very interesting place in Orthodox history. There was never a time in the history of Romania since the first century when Christianity wasn't there. The first bishop was a disciple of St. Andrew the Apostle. St. John the Cassian, the Roman, who was very popular in the West because he went to the Egyptian desert and collected the sayings of the desert fathers, the disciples of St. Anthony, from their own lips, and he wrote this down. He was originally from Romania. That was his home. He was already a Romanian monk when he went into the Egyptian desert. All through the history of Romania, Christianity had been there, not always common, but always there. And since the 14th century, the great age of Hesychasm, it had been kept in Romania. And so this was the country that we know of, Vlad Dracul, whom Bram Stoker infamously identified as Dracula, the Impaler, and then Dracula the Vampire. Vlad Dracul was none of those things. He was a hero of resistance against the invading Turks, and he and his cousin, St. Stephen the Great of Romania, drove back the Turks again and again. And when St. Stephen the Great would go to battle against the Turks, first he would go to his spiritual father, St. Daniel the Hesychist, who lived in a rock cave that he carved out himself. And he would go to him for confession. And then after the battle, when he won these battles against the Turks, he would build a new monastery. And these are the famous painted churches of Romania. And these were parts of hesychastic schools. And there were hagiographers there and calligraphers there. And so there was a beautiful tradition of art and bookmaking that was centered around hesychastic practice. And Elder Basil, who became St. Paisius' elder that he finally found in Romania, himself had been Russian and gone to Romania to find it and became the elder. And he was the elder of all of the hesychastic monks that were remaining at that time. So St. Paisius stayed with him, spent the rest of his life copying out these texts, which was very, very laborious. It took a lot of work. There was the copying, the editing, cleaning them up, and then, of course, learning how to live this life and teaching this life, because St. Paisius became the elder after Elder Basil. So it was through St. Paisius Velichkovsky, and this is the book that I have about him. I'm very fortunate to have this book because it's out of print. There are other accounts of his life that is written. He was able to go, well, he didn't go. He stayed in Romania, but his disciples returned to Russia and brought this way of life back to Russia through the Optina elders. And the St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood that Father Seraphim Rose founded has been very faithful in printing and publishing the lives of the elders of Optina, who were St. Paisius' disciples through time. So this is how it returned to Russia. And these elders of Optina were very influential. Dostoevsky was interested in them. Gogol, even Tolstoy was interested in the Optina elders. And they had influence on all of these. Meanwhile, on Mount Athos, those manuscripts that he had been able to collect, that he left behind when he went to Romania, they were found a generation later by St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. And so St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain and Macarius of Corinth then put together the Greek text of the Philokalia that was then printed and published. So this is the beginning of the rebirth of Hezekiah and the source of its current flowering in the Orthodox East, which is very, very much alive now. The process, though, by which it gained ground again on Mount Athos was by no means easy. It took several generations. This is a book, Contemporary Ascetics of Mount Athos. And in this book, there's an introduction written by Monk Gerasim Eliel, who's now Bishop Gerasim of the Orthodox Church of America in the South. And this essay, this introductory essay, explains what it took to bring this life back to Mount Athos. So the first generations of disciples of St. Macarius of Corinth and St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain were kicked off Mount Athos, and they went into exile on the islands of Greece, and it was a while before it came back to Mount Athos. But it did, and it's very much alive in Mount Athos today, and has come, to England and America from there. So it was actually, I'll tell you, it was actually Monk Gerasim, now Bishop Gerasim, who gave me this book in the mid-'80s. I'm very fortunate to have it. And I remember this was my first visit to Platina Monastery. I was there with Protodeacon Brendan of Dallas. And we read it all the way home. I was reading, he was driving. And he was very, very excited. He said, we have to become Orthodox. We weren't even catechumens at the time. I was a little more skeptical, but this was a long time ago. So the first English edition of the Philokalia, it came out first in 4 volumes from 1979 to 1995. And this is the work of Metropolitan Bishop Callistos Ware, Philip Sherrard, and G.E.H. Palmer. These are 3 Oxford and Cambridge educated scholars, pioneers among English-speaking converts to Orthodoxy, who put themselves to the task of giving this work to us in English. Volume 5 was just published by Metropolitan Callistos a couple of years ago, right before his death. And he apologized for taking so long, but he said he had to do this by himself because Sherrard and Palmer were already dead. So now all 3 of these editors have passed. Now, what I want to say about this, and I'm not going to say a lot about the writings themselves. I think that's for someone else to look into and to explain. But what I will say is at the end of each volume of this, there is a glossary of terms that is very, very important, I think. And if you look at these terms that they defined, because when this was edited and published, a lot of these Orthodox terms were not part of the English language even. And so they took care to define these terms. And this glossary actually contains a lot of the teachings in a rather systematic way. And if you were to rearrange the terms of this glossary, take it out of alphabetical order and rearrange them into certain categories, what you would come up with is 4 categories: the composition of created man, the fallen nature, the battle against temptation, and then the restoration of the image of God in man. And you could look at these terms and get an idea at least of what these writings are about. So under the composition of created man, it talks about the creation of man as body, soul, and spirit. The 3 aspects of the soul are as defined by Plato: the appetite, the intellectual power, and the incensive power. The glossary gives most attention to the appetite because that's where we are most affected. Plato taught that a man can control his appetite and then he can advance in wisdom. But the fathers point out that in fallen man, controlling the appetite is very difficult. And so they go about explaining how it is to be done. The heart is defined as the deepest part of man, the central core of man, not the mind, but the heart. And they give attention to the mind also, the division of the mind between what they call intellect and reason. Now, reason is the discursive faculty, it's the analytical faculty. But intellect is something else in their definitions. And really, what intellect is it's the noetic faculty. And the noetic faculty is the spiritual aspect of the mind. That is, it's that which perceives unseen mysteries directly, perceives them directly without the need for reason to explain it. And so there's this division of the mind between the noetic faculty and the reasoning faculty. And this division is part of the fall, that there's a barrier between them that we have to bridge. And this is done through purification of the mind. So then the terms in the glossary go to the fallen nature, and this explains the passions, how the passions are what the soul and the body experiences passively. That's where the word comes from. But it's things like anger, hunger, things like that. Things that are natural, but in fallen man are out of proportion. Then it gives a lot of thought, a lot of definition to what is wrong with the reasoning faculty. And here it introduces an important fact that modern psychology is very uncomfortable with, and that is the progress of our thoughts, our reason, and how we're really not very well in control of our reason, even when we think we are. This is very important. And so the fathers talk about this thing that we're so uncomfortable with, demonic influence. That yes, there are spiritual, bodiless powers that are part of creation. They are intelligent beings. They were once angelic. But like man, they were created with free will, and they rebelled, turned away from God, and so they darkened their intellects, and they darken ours with subtle reasoning that comes through thoughts that are not always of our own creation, and explain that we are free to accept or reject these thoughts. And this is the process of temptation. And so they give a lot of time to explaining what temptation is and the process of temptation, how it begins with a thought and then moves from there to entertaining the thought. And then after entertaining the thought, maybe we'll consent with the will to the thought to carry this action through. And then the action can become a habit. And that is how we are corrupted through temptation. Now, how can we tell the difference between thoughts that come from this direction or thoughts that come from that direction or thoughts that are our own thoughts? And the fathers say, well, this is what's hardest. We think these are all our own thoughts and we're in control of them. But we're losing control of our thoughts constantly. That's the problem. That's the battle. That's really what the Philokalia is about. So how does this spiritual battle fought to gain control? And it has to happen through faith. It has to happen through help from God. But it also requires hard work. It requires recognizing temptation and struggling against it. It requires faith. It requires compunction. And it requires repentance. And this is a really important term. And the Greek word is not repentance. The Greek word is metania, which means a transformation of the nous. In other words, a total metamorphosis of the mind, which turns the whole being towards God and an illumination of faith. But this also requires watchfulness and discrimination, and this is something that only comes after long practice. So the glossary of terms will also explain what the Jesus prayer is, why remembrance of God is important, and what the intense spiritual longing is that goads us towards God. And then the final group of terms has to do with the restoration of the image of God in man. And this is where we learn to recognize God as the Logos, the true word, the word that comes from God, how the Logos created the original order of creation and how it's been distorted. We learn dispassion as freedom from forceful passions, and we get introduced to this term contemplation. And contemplation is, in a sense, like the term that they use for intellect. When these writings were originally translated, the idea of the nous, noetic understanding, was not well understood. I think that by now, noetic understanding is well enough understood in Orthodox circles, in English Orthodox circles, that it's a better translation for the noetic than intellect is. And contemplation also is not, that does not mean in the Philokalia thinking about something. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean ruminating like we're doing now. Contemplation means theoria. And theoria is when the person begins to experience the uncreated energies of God. It means being immersed in God. It means progressing in God. It means becoming godlike. And so spiritual knowledge, Hezekiah, these are terms that are defined. And it's worth looking at this. And theology, according to the Philokalia, does not mean a system of thought. It means ascent into God. That's what it means. So I rearranged these terms, and I published this on my writer's blog, so you can look at this. And I think it's a good idea to do that. I put it on my writer's blog, which is Orthodox Illumination. That's on WordPress, wordpress.com, Orthodox Illumination. It's my most recent post, so it should be easy to find. Go there and take a look at it. And I think it's very instructive as an introduction to the whole theology of the Philokalia. So these are ruminations that I feel are worthy of sharing among the bards, we who are seeking genuine inspiration. I am Christopher Lewis.